Okay, good morning. This is the first day of the occupational hygiene course for the fall of 2012. My name is Bob Hutzel, and I'll be your instructor for the course this semester. And to get started with, what I want to do is to begin by reviewing the syllabus that you have access to. And I have it shown here on the screen. And we start off with the course objective is basically designed to give you, the students, the environmental technology program, an understanding of the basic fundamentals of industrial hygiene and occupational health. The second section, you'll see the dates for the course. And we are recording today on Friday, August 31st. And you'll notice in the syllabus is that we are doing the recording primarily on Fridays with one exception. This is to enable us to accommodate various sections of the course where we're going to need to be able to use the laboratory and instruments and have guest speakers and so on. So it's not our routine Friday-Saturday rotation. The textbook for the class is the Fundamentals of Industrial Hygiene. This is the 5th edition. This is the one that if you go through the bookstore, you'll be able to purchase. It's a fairly thick book, and believe it or not, we're going to cover a majority of the material that's in there. And so you'll definitely need to have the book. If you have an earlier version or earlier edition, you should be okay to be able to use that. For the most part, there's only a couple of exceptions where we may run into a little difficulty by using an earlier edition. So if you are using an earlier edition book, then let me know so we don't run into complications with you using that earlier edition. You know how to get that ladybug. Okay, and then the rest of the syllabus, you'll see what the subject materials that we'll be covering. I'll review that in more detail in a minute. But notice there are projects assigned with each day, and I'll review what those are as well. The grading system for the class is pretty much a standard 90% and above for an A, 80% for a B, 70% for C. Most students shouldn't have any problems achieving either an A or a B if you do all the work that has been assigned. And then another component of the class, besides the exams that you'll get and the projects, will be to prepare a paper. As you can see here on the paper, you can prepare it based on any kind of chemical or physical hazard. That would be a specific chemical, mercury, benzene, toluene, whatever chemical you have an interest in. Or you can do a physical hazard. We talk about physical hazards such as noise, heat stress, radiation, and those types of things. Another thing you could do is a specific industrial process. For example, if you wanted to talk about the hazards associated with electroplating or sandblasting or some industrial process like that. Or if you're working in an industry and you have a particular process that is of interest to you and you want to do a paper on the hazards associated with that, you can do that as well. And the other thing you could do is a specific industry. If you want to talk about an industry you're working for and discuss what types of health hazards are associated with that, you can do that. I would try to encourage you to do your papers on a specific chemical or physical hazards versus the others. The others, it can get a little more complex for you to do it in the amount of written length of the paper as well as your presentation. So what I want you to do is when you select your project or your paper subject, is to email your subject material to me, and I'll record that subject. I'll look and see what it is. If it looks like an acceptable subject, then I'll give you the go-ahead for it. And what I want to try to do is make sure that each individual student does the presentation on a different subject material. So if somebody says they want to do their paper on mercury, and I've given them that subject, if somebody else wants to do it on mercury, then it'll be too late because it's already taken. So you'll have to select another subject material. Primarily, that's for my own benefit. I don't want to sit and read 5 papers on mercury. Along with doing, as far as the paper goes, it'll be 5 pages minimum. Try to keep it within 5, no more than 7, and that's double spaced. And that is text material. I don't want you to sit and do a paper and put 2 or 3 pages of graphs or tables and say, well, I met the limited criteria. If you're going to use tables and graphs and everything, put those in a separate section so it's not included into your length of the paper. Then you'll also be required to do a presentation. For those students who are in the class, if you want to get up and do the presentation in front of class, you can. I encourage you to do that just for the practice. But everybody in the class, online people, will prepare a PowerPoint presentation and submit your PowerPoint presentation as part of your paper, and that will account for your presentation. So that's a quick overview of the syllabus. If we look at, it is, I'll refer to it, although your course catalog and everything says occupational hygiene. In our class, we'll refer to it more as industrial hygiene course. The reason we can't use industrial hygiene in the title, in the catalog system, is that about 30 years ago, the engineering department had a course titled industrial hygiene, and they got that name, and we can't use it. So we're having to use the fundamentals of occupational hygiene. A little bit about myself. My name is Bob Hutzel. I'm a certified industrial hygienist and a certified safety professional. I own a consulting company. That company's name is Hutzel & Associates. We've been in business for over 22 years. This is my company phone number, 602-323-0222. If you need to get a hold of me, you can try to call me and talk to me through that phone number. Also, you can use my email address, which is rlhutzel@aol.com. When you email me something, I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. A lot of that will depend on where I'm at, at a particular time, whether I'm in state or out of state, of how rapidly I'll be able to get back to you, but I will respond to you. A little bit about my background. I started in the environmental health field when I was in the Air Force back in the early 70s. After getting out of the Air Force, I went to work for Arizona OSHA down in Tucson. And at that particular time, the University of Arizona was one of the 13 universities that NIOSH funded for an industrial hygiene program. And I entered that program and was the first graduate out of that program. While I was in that program, I worked for the University of Arizona as an industrial hygienist. And following graduation out of the University of Arizona, I was hired by Salt River Project, which is a public power utility company, second largest in the state, with coal fire and gas-fired power stations throughout the state of Arizona. I developed their corporate industrial hygiene over the course of 10 years, And at the beginning of 1990, I left and started my own company. I've been teaching at ASU here this particular course since 1983, which turns out to be almost 29 years. There's a second course I also teach for them, which is the Advanced Industrial Hygiene course, and some of you may decide that you would like to pursue that course as well. Especially in that course is particularly designed for somebody who has an interest and desire to try to pursue the Certified Industrial Hygiene designation. As you can see, I am a certified industrial hygienist. To become a certified industrial hygienist, you basically need to have a degree in industrial hygiene or environmental or some related science. You have to have 5 years of work experience. That can be verified by a certified industrial hygienist. And then you will challenge a examination that covers all the related subject materials that an industrial hygienist should know. Pretty much the subject materials like what we'll be covering in this course. And once you successfully pass that examination, then you get the designation of a certified industrial hygienist. There's roughly about 6,500 certified industrial hygienists in the world who are actively practicing. I'm also a certified safety professional, and you obtain that certification much the same way as you do the industrial hygiene certification. You have to have the education, a work experience, and pass an examination, which is basically an emphasis of on safety related information. I've also published in the American Industrial Hygiene Journal, published an article in the 80s on sampling methodologies. It used to be, for the first 2 years after publishing that paper, it would be a signed reading document for the students. But fortunately for you, the article's too old and it's not required to be a mandatory reading section. What I would like to do is get to know each of you individually. It's very hard when we do online courses to know about the students, and since we can't have those introductions here in class, what I'd like you to do is email me your introduction with your name, your educational status, whether you're undergraduate, graduate, where you're at in the program, also your work status if you are in the working world. Just kind of give me a little briefing of what you do, what your title is, how long you've been with the company, and so on. This is also tell me about your personal life, is what you like to do, your hobbies, where you live, and things like that. Just an opportunity for me to try to get somewhat familiarity with the people who are on the other end of that camera, since I can't see you, but you can see. Okay, we'll go into a little more detail on the subjects that will be talked about that were covered on the syllabus. Day one, which is today, we're going to cover the introduction, which we're going through now, and a little bit of the history of industrial hygiene. We'll have a quick review of math, chemistry, anatomy, and physiology, just to make sure everybody is up to speed on that subject material. We'll have a small section on industrial toxicology. For any of you who have taken Dr. Olson's course on industrial toxicology, this will be a quick refresher of some of the material you most likely have learned from that course. And then we'll end up the day talking about regulations and standards and permissible exposure limits and TOVs. As I mentioned, associated with each day, there are projects. Those projects are uploaded on the Blackboard. You can open up those projects, answer them, and then download them on the Blackboard, and I will then grade them. And once you finished your projects and they've been graded, I will send you the answer key so you will know if you've missed any of the questions, what the correct answer is. It is important that you try to complete these projects before you take the first examination, because the material that are covered in the projects could well be on the examination. Day 2, we're going to talk about the units of measurement and airborne concentrations of chemical hazards. We'll talk about some specific chemical hazards, a little bit on oxygen deficient environments and flammable liquids. We'll discuss some of the typical operations and processes where we find potential health hazards. We're going to talk a little bit about the OSHA Hazard Communication Program, and specifically we're going to talk about some new changes that came about with that program. And finally on that day we'll talk about the specific OSHA standards that apply to us in the industrial hygiene field. Again, there will be projects associated with that lecture material. On day 3, it's kind of a fun day. We talk about industrial hygiene surveys. We'll have demonstrations of direct reading instruments, long-term sampling, and we typically have a calibration and sampling instrument workshop. Now that workshop will be attended by those people who are in the in-class session, but anyone who is online who wants to come to that workshop and have the opportunity to work with the instruments firsthand, you're welcome to come to that class. It will be in the afternoon after the lecture material. Again, that's on will be on a Friday. So the date is on the syllabus of what that Friday is to be, the 3rd Friday. So it should be September 28th, it looks like. So if you do want to come and have the opportunity to learn how to use instruments that we use in the industrial hygiene field, I encourage you to try to come if you have the opportunity to do so. On day 4, we're going to talk about control measures that are used in industrial hygiene to prevent people from becoming exposed. Those control measures can include ventilation systems, respirators, personal protective equipment, and so on. We'll also have a discussion on indoor air quality, because in the industrial hygiene field in the last 20 years, that has become a real prominent issue that industrial hygienists are required to face and deal with. So, for the lack of a better place to put it within the syllabus time, I've included it during the day 4 lecture. On day 5, we're going to focus on talking about the physical hazards, noise, radiation, temperature extremes, which could include heat stress as well as cold stress, a little bit on ergonomics, and finally a small section on biological hazards. Where on the final day, then we'll talk about careers in occupational safety and health. Those of you who are in the environmental technology program, there's some of you that may have an interest in pursuing a career path as an occupational safety or health, or oftentimes more likely you'll be responsible as an environmental health and safety manager. You may have responsibility for industrial hygiene and safety programs. So we'll try to give you a little bit of a overview of what career paths are available there. Then we'll also have some guest lecturers come in and talk about industrial hygiene programs in their particular industry. I oftentimes have a individual who's a professional expert in risk management and the concept of risk management, loss prevention, and the roles that occupational safety and health professionals as well as environmental professionals play in that. Sometimes I try to bring in some other guest speakers, as students always seem to enjoy hearing those people versus listening to me talk all the time. As we said, we've already covered the research projects, but there'd be about and the grading system. So that's pretty much an overview of the what the course is going to be. Hopefully it's something that you'll enjoy. And that, we'll go ahead and proceed with a little bit of introduction and history to industrial hygiene. To start with, the best way to start the course is to give you a definition of industrial hygiene. And as we go through and we talk about different subject materials, as you notice, there's an exam that correlates with every lecture day. So you'll have 5 exams. After this lecture material today, you'll review that, and you'll work on your projects that are associated with that information that was covered in that day, and the exam will cover the material that we discussed. At the end of the lecture today, I'll review a little bit about how you should prepare, the types of questions you should have. As we go through the lecture material, though, I'll also try to point out to you things that would most likely be on the exam. So first and foremost, this definition will definitely be a question on the examination, and you'll be expected to answer that question basically word for word of how it's written here. So the definition of industrial hygiene is basically the science and art devoted to the anticipation, recognition, evaluation, and control of those environmental factors or stresses arising in or from the workplace or the community which may cause sickness, impaired health and well-being, or significant discomfort and inefficiency among workers or among the citizens of the community. Science and art devoted to the anticipation, recognition, evaluation, and control of those environmental factors or stresses arising in or from the workplace which may cause sickness, impaired health and well-being, or significant discomfort and inefficiency among workers or among the citizens of the community. So that will be the answer to your question, is what is the definition of industrial hygiene? Now there are some key words that you'll also have to list and explain on the exam. And those are, first of all, stresses. The stresses that are dealt with by the industrial hygienist are chemical stresses, physical, biological, and ergonomics. Chemical stresses include gases, vapors, dust, fumes, mist. Physical hazards include noise, radiation, temperature extremes. Biological hazards, such things as bacteria, virus, and fungi, insects, and ergonomic hazards, which deal with the man-machine interface, or repetitive motion, or office and equipment design, and so on. So those are the stresses that the industrial hygienist typically will focus on in the course of performing their duties. The other key words in the definition that you'll need to discuss are anticipation, recognition, evaluation, and control. Anticipation is basically to predict a problem. About 20 years ago, they added this word to the definition. Primarily, it's designed to ensure that the industrial hygienist gets involved in the design and development and build-out of industrial processes and operations, to be able to lend their professional support in letting people in that design aspect understand what potential health hazards could be created in the course of the building and designing of this particular process or operation. For recognition, basically what we're referring to here is where the industrial hygienist goes out and conducts surveys to identify the potential hazards that are associated with stresses or conditions out in the workplace. Once the industrial hygienist conducts these surveys, they'll typically go into the evaluation mode, where that's when we take instruments and sampling equipment out to test for the concentration of the potential hazards, be it chemical hazards, be it physical hazards, and so on. And then finally, the final key word in the definition is control. Once we've identified the problem, we've gone out, we've measured it, we've sampled for it, we've determined that it is present. Now what do we need to do, or what do we need to implement to ensure that the workers are not exposed to that potential hazard? So we look to reduce or eliminate those hazards. Some of the functions that industrial hygienists typically perform in the course of their professional careers, as I mentioned, conducting surveys, examinations, investigations of environmental conditions, to be able to say what's here and how much of it's here. We interpret the data that we go out and gather, and we compare that data to recognize standards or guidelines that will tell us, is this okay, or is it safe, or do we have a potential problem or a situation where workers could be exposed. If we do have a situation where people are exposed, then the industrial hygienist works with management and operating groups to come up with control measures to reduce or eliminate, as I mentioned earlier, the potential for those exposures, the potential to do adverse effects to the working population. The industrial hygienist can also be involved when standards are in the development. As you and the environmental programs proceed into your careers, you will find that new regulations are often proposed and potentially with the intent of implementation. And you can have the opportunity to provide comment during the developmental stage of those rules or regulations, be it on your own as a professional or as a representative of the company that you work for. So that is a task that often is performed by an industrial hygienist. In addition, you could be involved in doing court testimony. You are working for a company, that testimony may be in the form of testifying at a workers' compensation hearing, or if there's a legal case that maybe OSHA has brought against you, you may have to go and do testimony about your company, your work practices and procedures, and so on. If you're in the industrial hygiene consulting business, such as myself, we do a lot of court testimony in a variety of legal cases that surround industrial hygiene related issues. You can also be involved in research, or in some cases, industrial hygienists may pursue the education and training track. But if you do work for an industry, you will certainly be involved in providing education and training to those workers in your workforce. So if we try to take a look at the history of industrial hygiene, and there's a lot of people, and maybe even some of you in this course, have not heard of or are not real familiar with what industrial hygiene is. That's not uncommon. A lot of people, with respect to certain career paths, industrial hygiene is a fairly new career path in the last 2-3 decades, 4 decades, much like the environmental professional career path. And basically, looking at industrial hygiene from a broad perspective, it's basically that science which is geared towards protection of human health within the environment. How do we control those environments to where it does not do damage to human health. It was once written by a scholar that said it's often assumed that people move through the environment and mold it to their desires, but it's probably more accurate to say that people in the environment move, change together and have an impact on each other. From a historical standpoint, prior to the 1900s, there basically was very limited, if any, concern for protection or regarding the health of workers. If we go back to the very beginning of existence of civilization, just to live and survive in the environment was a challenge. As social classes began to develop in the early times, we saw the implementation of slave labor. Those people who were the more wealthy and the elite, they utilized slaves to perform those tasks that were potentially dangerous or harmful to an individual. In fact, if you look at the history of the Egyptian culture, you would find that basically if you were Egyptian, you were not allowed to perform common labor, and you utilized manual labor and you utilized perform those tasks. So there was really a limited, if any, concern about the safety or health of workers. We can go back in the archives of literature and find various well-known people who dealt with, in some way, occupational health issues or industrial hygiene issues, if you will. And some of the earliest accounts we found were in Hippocrates, back between, existed between 460 and 370 BC. And one of the things that Hippocrates did was one of the first people to record or at least make mention of the potential for occupational diseases. He would describe ailments that people who worked in the mining industries, metallurgists, dye makers, tailors, horsemen, farmhands, fishermen, and so on. And one of the significant things he did, he recognized and recorded the effects of lead exposure in the mining and smelting industry. And ironically, lead is still one of our biggest hazards or significant hazard that we encounter in the workplace. There was a gentleman called Pliny the Elder, and again, his existence was between 23 and 79 AD, and he did work, again, related to the mines. And you'll notice that as you look historically, that a lot of the treatment of occupational health hazards really dealt with miners and mining-associated operations, because that was a fairly dangerous type of occupation. And one of the things that Pliny the Elder was noted for was describing a protective mask that miners could use to protect themselves against the dangerous dusts and gas and vapors that they would encounter in the mining operations. And what he would do is he recommended using an animal bladder to cover the nose and the mouth of those workers. And it's oftentimes, I do a lot of training or have in the past on respirator protection, and you frequently hear how workers hate to wear respirators and moan and groan and bitch about it. Can you imagine the problems Pliny the Elder might have trying to get workers to put an animal bladder on their face? Our challenge is probably not nearly that difficult. Then we move on and we find Galen, who was a Greek physician, and again described diseases associated with farming, wrestlers, wet nurses, gypsum workers, and those who use their voices extremely or excessively, some of the hazards associated with the stress of doing that. He also recognized the dangers of acid mists in copper smelting or copper mining operations, and noted that students and scholars often suffer from the vapors of the tallow candles that were used for them to provide light, be able to do their studies. Found that those students and scholars would develop dizziness and chest pains. Found that runners frequently would develop problems with the lung. Then we make a giant move forward to Ulrich Allenbach, who was a German physician, and one of the things that he recognized is that vapors of some metals were dangerous, and described the symptoms of industrial poisoning from lead and mercury. And one of the things that he did was came up with some preventative measures. A lot of the prior work talked about what the dangers were, but very few really addressed how do you prevent or protect against these dangers. He did publish a pamphlet on occupational disease and hygiene, which was one of the first ones published, that described these protective measures. In 14th, 15th centuries, we saw Agricola, who was basically a founder of geology, and he published a 12-volume set of books that described various metallurgic metals types of geological types of issues, described some of the things like mercury problems, ailments, and accidents that could be noted in miners. Again, exposure to cold water in mines, the dust in mines causing difficulty in breathing, corrosive dust that would eat away at the lungs. He went on to describe how Carpathian mountain women would have several husbands due to their premature death of the husbands that they had. Talked about stagnant air in mine shafts and how it was difficult to breathe, and even went on to describe ventilation systems that could be used to improve the quality of the air in those mine shafts. He talked about how these caverns would emit pungent vapors that would put out lights and kill miners. Those are things such as methane gases and so on. Not only did he talk about some of the health hazards associated with mines, he also talked about the safety conditions that hazards of mine created, such as falling from ladders into the shafts, workers breaking legs, breaking their necks, falling down into sumps and drowning, the actual cave-ins of the mines, and crushing of men, venomous insects such as ants and so on that existed in the mines. And even though he identified all of these dangers and these hazards, he went on to talk about what the benefits of that mining processes were and how they would outweigh the dangers that those mines could create. We move forward, and there's a gentleman by the name of Paracelsus who was basically referred to as kind of the premier person involved in toxicology. He was aware of diseases, again, primarily associated with miners and smelters. And one of the key phrases that he had was that all substances are poisons. There is none which is not a poison. The right dose differentiates a poison and a remedy. And this is basically the concept of toxicology, and and led to the development of certain medicinal products being used to treat illnesses that if you had too much of it, you could die from it. So he understood that the dose differentiates a material from whether it's medicinal for a particular individual or problem, or whether it could be lethal or dangerous to